Good morning, Mr. Verner, and so much. It's a pleasure to have you in Namibia.
Good morning, Lord, and thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Now, we know that this is a 3-day event, which is a theme that is about Namibia becoming an energy hub within country value. In terms of this theme, what does it mean to you, especially the fact that you are representing the Africa Energy Chamber?
Well, first of all, let me start by thanking Selma for bringing us here today to discuss about what are very critical matters, not just for Namibia, but really for the rest of Africa. In terms of an energy hub and increasing country value, what is important to understand that Namibia is uniquely placed because of where it sits on the map in the continent. You know, if you look at the amount of solar that you can generate, if you look at the amount of wind that you can generate in that sense, if you look at connectivity to other countries which are bordering Namibia, as well as the enormous oil and gas resources which have been discovered in Namibia. So Namibia is really uniquely placed to be able to develop all these resources, not just for the benefit of Namibia, but ultimately to be able to power the entire SADC region and even beyond. So the notion of a hub is really spot on in that sense with respect to Namibia. Now, with respect to developing that particular hub, you need to be able to use in-country value chains to ensure that the wealth which is generated in the generation of these resources is ultimately generated within Namibia and stays significantly within Namibia. It's ultimately about avoiding the resource curse.
Maybe just touching a little bit on that. If I'm a local businessman that's probably watching this show right now, I'm talking about a country in value, country value proposition. What are some of the possible benefits, just in a nutshell, that possibly could exist for Namibian business?
That's a great question, Lord. Well, in a nutshell, you need to be able to make sure that you can meet energy as well as industry standards to be able to meet the demands of the industry. Now, people are coming and going to work on rigs. They need to eat. They need their clothes washed. They need to stay in hotels. You need to ensure that whatever business it is that you are in, where there is a demand for that, you can meet industry standards and ensure that you can provide those services to the oil and gas industry. But be careful. What we don't want is we don't want Namibian teachers to start looking to go on oil rigs. Because you know what? Namibian kids also need a great education. And we need to ensure that the industry can certainly tap into the significant potential that the Namibian youth represents. But let's be careful. We do not want everybody in Namibia to leave their jobs and basically move into the oil and gas industry.
So the oil and gas sector must support other efforts that government is doing to ensure
that is absolutely correct. We want to ensure that as Namibia generates these resources out of the oil and gas space, that those resources ultimately help to drive the entire economy.
Okay. There has been a lot of emphasis since the opening of the conference about local content. Maybe, again, just explaining what the local content within the content of local capacity, value addition, energy independence, what does it mean for Namibia?
Well, now, there are many people who look at local content in multiple different ways. What I think and what we at the African Energy Chamber think is ultimately that the resources, that the dollars that are being generated out of the industry ultimately help to beneficiate Namibians overall. And there are multiple ways. One of the major ways is ensuring that these value chains that are in the industry are powered and driven by Namibians. We were just talking about Namibian businesses. Now, Namibian women are great entrepreneurs. The experience which I've had here in the country, we have seen touring agencies, we have ultimately been seeing catering companies which are driven by local Namibians, but also where you can have engineering services that can be provided by Namibians. So we're looking across the value chain. But one needs to understand that the companies in Namibia, as long as they meet industry standards, should have an opportunity. They should actually have priority. And that is where the government comes in to be able to help regulate and drive local content that is also supportive of the industry and collaborating with the industry.
So if I'm getting you correct, the ripple effect of this industry, oil and gas, and even the the other streams that comes out of it, there's a multiple ability to be able not only to generate revenue for government, not only be able to create jobs for Namibians, but also to possibly secure their future in the long term.
I'll even tell you, I'll go further. I want this industry to drive and develop the new Namibian billionaires. The new African billionaires on the continent should be Namibia. But that is going to come at the cost of doing the job properly. That is going to come at the cost of doing local content properly. Local content that is collaborative with the industry to ensure that the Namibian companies that are going to be going into this are keeping a global standard that can make the industry competitive. Because you need to remember this is a global industry with global competition. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration to be able to ensure that local content ultimately ends up benefiting Namibians.
Let's talk about the fact that there's so much being talked about. Namibia needs to convert its hydrocarbon potential into a broad-based economic development tool. Is this interrelated to the other points that you're talking about, ensuring that locals are capacitated, locals be the majority to benefit out of this?
Absolutely.
And what does hydrocarbon mean for most Namibians who are watching?
Well, one thing I can tell you is simple. Nobody drinks hydrocarbon. Nobody sleeps in hydrocarbon. We certainly need good housing in Namibia. We need agriculture to function. We need services to function. We need our kids to go to great schools. So ultimately, as the country generates that wealth, it is our wish at the African Energy Chamber that we can avoid some of the traps that we have seen in other countries where the wealth that is being generated does not really get spread across the board to drive all other industry. So our hope is that as the hydrocarbons industry in Namibia really gets to grow, that the wealth and the revenue that is generated there does not stay in that industry, but ultimately broadens and seeps through the entire economy. The last thing we want is from people to leave from the north of Namibia to come and want to work on the oil rigs. We don't want to empty those villages. We do love to see that the entire economy, tourism, agriculture, ultimately ends up benefiting from the industry without sucking the life out of all of those industries.
Okay. Let's talk about the importance of regulatory and physical stability in a nascent oil sector such as in Namibia. How important are those two?
They're the key. You need to understand, everyone needs to understand Namibia is not competing with Angola. Namibia is competing with Guyana, Gulf of Mexico, South America. If those dollars don't come here, they're going to go there. They're going to find a home. So how do you ensure that investors continue to come to this beautiful country? By making sure that the fiscal environment, the fiscal regimes that are in place are fit for purpose. Now, when you ultimately discover oil and you change the game book, what is going to happen is that ultimately, and we've seen this is not new, people are going to move somewhere else and are going to invest their money somewhere else. So in terms of the fiscals, it's extremely important to keep an eye on what others are doing and stay competitive. But we need government. We need government to regulate. We need government to ensure that the right kind of environment, people get permits on time, work permits, visas, whatever, to get them on time once they have applied and once they have ensured that they can get that on time and the entire industry can move. The tax authorities across the board in that sense. Because it's not only good for the oil and gas industry, it's also good for Namibians.
In terms of avoiding this oil case that you have talked about earlier, what some call the Dutch case, for instance, is now, what do we, when we saw the president deliver the message saying oil sector should work firstly for Namibians, together with Namibians, so they can be able to benefit through the message that was delivered by the Prime Minister, what should Namibian authorities be doing to ensure that we avoid some of the situations that are happening in Angola right now, some of the situations that is happening in Nigeria? What can we do differently moving forward to ensure that really the first beneficiary of this oil and gas sector are Namibians, change the lives of Namibians? What can we do that should be different from those other two countries? If there are 2 points to take away from Namibians who are watching.
Well, I don't think, what the Call the Dutch is particular about just the oil industry. We can talk about mining, we can talk about forestry, we can talk about a whole bunch of different industries. We can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about government contracts. I think it's important to ensure that there is transparency. Namibians need to hold their government accountable. I mean, they've done that by voting in the first female president in this country. Great stuff which is happening in that sense. Holding the government accountable ultimately ensures that resources are used for the benefit of all. I think it's important to understand that. And by the way, you called a couple of countries. Some of them are doing much better in terms of being able to learn from the mistakes. So one thing I would leave you with is Namibia just needs to learn from the mistakes of some of the African countries and adopt what they're doing, which is working. It's not everything that is working. A lot of things are not working. Make sure you stay away from that. But if you look at it in detail, in that sense, you can ensure that transparency is what it is. You can be sure that transparency is what it is that ultimately drives accountability and ensures that resources are used in the manner in which they are supposed to be used.
Well, Mr. Verner, thank you so much for making time to speak to us this morning. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much, and may you enjoy the rest of your time here in Namibia.
It's always a pleasure to be in Namibia. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Now that concludes our engagement. That's with the Senior Vice President of the Africa Energy Chamber, that is Verner Ayukegba, who was talking to us about the 7th edition of the Namibia International Energy Conference that is currently underway here in Namibia, in the nation's capital.